Throughout the 1450s and 60s, during the Wars of the Roses, an English knight by the name of Sir Thomas Malory was in and out of prison as a minor political figure and potential criminal. And unfortunately for Malory, he would spend much of his final 2 decades of life as a prisoner. Fortunately for us, he would spend much of his remaining life as a prisoner writing an absolute banger of a book we now call Morte Darthur. Morte Darthur, for those who've never heard of it, is an old-timey French way of saying the death of Arthur. It is not the title Malory gave the book, but something someone else called it later that just stuck, and we've been stuck calling it that ever since. And the Morte Darthur, the English prison book with the sticky French name, is undoubtedly one of the most influential and definitive Arthurian tales ever told. Ranging anywhere from 700 to 1,000 pages in modern editions, Malory's Arthurian epic weaves together many of Camelot's most iconic tales, all framed by King Arthur's life, from his conception, that's right, conception, until his death. And while its influence on later Arthuriana is huge, I actually want to focus not on the Arthur of it all, but on the fantasy, because Le Morte Darthur isn't just a pivotal work in the history of King Arthur, but in the history of fantasy literature as well. It's what John Clute refers to as a taproot text, something influential in the fantasy tradition, but written before our modern idea of fantasy had formed. Fantasy scholar Brian Attebery calls Malory a proto-fantasist, and in the short history of fantasy, Farah Mendelssohn and Edward James identified Le Morte Darthur as an important fantastical work of the medieval period. But so often, conversations like these relegate a text like Le Morte Darthur to a precursor, something old upon which newer authors have improved. So instead, I want to ask what might seem like a funny question. Instead of thinking of Malory's book as a taproot text, can we instead think of Le Morte Darthur itself as fantasy? Well, sorta, yes, but no. As much as fantastical things happen, putting the Morte into what fantasy scholars call the fantastic mode as opposed to a realist mode, fantasy, as it's often understood, is a genre in most cases applied to books, movies, or television programs of the late 20th and early 21st century, perhaps most famously associated with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings or the Game of Thrones TV show. So while Le Morte Darthur is fantastic, it's hard to call it fantasy, in part because Le Morte already has a genre. It's what we call a chivalric romance, called a romance because the first types of the genre were written in Romance languages, like French. And in the High and Late Middle Ages, these were the stories of knights going on adventures to win the love of fair ladies through honorable and chivalric deeds of arms. If you've ever seen A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, this movie pays huge homage to chivalric romances. It's also worth noting that Le Morte Darthur is not a novel. The novel as a form doesn't develop until a little later, and while the technical term for Malory's book is a prose romance, there's actually some debate about what Malory's book is. You could call it one huge romance, but it could very well be something closer to a collection or sequence or even a trilogy. To be frank, it's uncertain what Malory intended, and various parts of Le Morte Darthur suggest both that it is many small pieces and yet one continuous narrative. But it is clear that if Le Morte is both a different genre and form, then in a number of ways we have to say, no, Le Morte Darthur is not a fantasy. But here's the fun part. I don't think that stops us from reading the Morte Darthur as fantasy. Normally, it's bad advice to analyze a text by the standards of another literary context. It can feel like measuring distance by kilograms. But I'm going to propose that we do exactly that, not by ignoring the chivalric romance, but by incorporating it into our reading. If we read Le Morte Darthur using the generic expectations a reader would bring to an epic fantasy novel, fully conscious of the fact that we are layering the two genres over top of each other, interesting patterns start to emerge. See, the reason I'm asking any of this in the first place is that genre defines how we read a story. The implicit contract between writer and reader dictates that a narrative will follow a discernible pattern, making narrative techniques legible to the reader. Readers of mysteries, for example, expect their authors to craft narrative puzzles with clues for them to solve, while writers of mysteries learn from existing novels how to craft new puzzles that tell new stories. It would be frustrating, though, if you tried to read a modern romance novel or western by the standards of a mystery, as you search for clues that simply aren't there. Some books claim not to follow a genre's formula at all, but even these are defining themselves by their break from convention, relying on your expectations in order to subvert them. Genres get increasingly complicated as we consider subgenres of the evolution of genres, but suffice it to say that genre plays a huge role in how we read a story. That's why we cannot simply label Le Morte Darthur a fantasy. It is already chivalric romance, and the techniques of that genre are present throughout in a way we cannot simply ignore. But by reading Le Morte Darthur as fantasy, we are not merely playing semantic tricks with arbitrary categories. We are making conscious our layering of the epic fantasy genre over top of the existing chivalric romance, using the original genre as a guide for how to read the newer one. In other words, we have to know how to read the chivalric romance in order to understand how the fantasy elements are functioning in the narrative. But if we can do that, it will reveal Le Morte Darthur from an entirely new perspective, teaching us things about the text, fantasy, chivalric romances, and about genre in general. So not only do I think we can read the Morte Darthur as fantasy, but I think that doing so is valuable for more than just the mental exercise. It reveals everything in a new light, teaching us about all the pieces and their relationships. So, for the remainder of this video, I'm going to defend why I think Le Morte Darthur can be read as fantasy. I'm going to explore some of the theory for how I make this argument, and I'll finish off with some ideas on how this changes our analysis of text. And whether you're intimately familiar with all things Arthur, a big fantasy fan, or just a curious viewer looking into something new, I'm hoping this video will have something to offer everyone. If your reaction is something along the lines of obviously King Arthur is fantasy, stop wasting our time, or genres are made up and limiting and I just want to enjoy the book, power to you. There are a lot of ways to read a book, and this is only one of them. But even if this frustrates how we normally read, or some of the analysis seems obvious, I'm hoping this enhances our reading experience by directing our attention in new ways. If we're all ready then, let's go on a train of thought. The first thing I want to talk about is genre, and this requires a pair of disclaimers. First, fantasy is represented in a wide range of mediums, novels, films, television, and music, to name a few. In this video, I will be referring to fantasy novels. I do not want to misrepresent written fantasy as all fantasy, or to give a false impression about any of the other forms. There is certainly overlap in fantasy works in different mediums, but it is important to keep these distinctions in mind as we investigate genres specifically. So for this video, when I say fantasy, I'm talking about fantasy novels. Second, fantasy novels encompass a number of genres or subgenres, like sword and sorcery, urban fantasy, school fantasy, and others. To keep things manageable, this video narrows in on epic fantasy, one of the most well-represented and acclaimed of fantasy subgenres. I just don't want to give the impression that all the fantasy subgenres are the same way I didn't want to give the impression that all the mediums were the same. So for this video, we're talking epic fantasy. With that out of the way, what then is a genre? A stuffy, authoritative definition might sound something like this. A genre is a recurring type of category of text as defined by structural, thematic, and/or functional criteria. And while this may not be mind-blowing, it offers us a good place to start. A genre is a story type that gets used often enough to become recognizable to both writers and readers, and usually its definitive quality, the thing that gets recognized as fantasy, as horror, or as mystery, is one or more of a few things. The narrative structure, what's the plot, the themes or mood, how is the story told, and the tropes and narrative devices, what are the common archetypes, settings, or events. Because a genre needs to be repeated enough times to become recognizable, however, some readers decry genre for its predictability. But what if I told you that its predictability is exactly what makes genre interesting, especially in speculative fiction like sci-fi, horror, or fantasy? Stories can be a lot of things, but stories are very much our attempt to find meaning in the wild unpredictability of life, to make order out of the chaos. Often, narratives give us comfort. The good guys win, the bad guys are punished, and moral goodness is upheld. But often, when a narrative structure, a central theme, or a collection of tropes and devices become recognizable enough, we start to predict their pattern before it happens, and the comfort they offer us becomes stagnated or boring. Does this mean a genre is tapped out? Of course not. It means a skilled writer is going to play with those expectations, using story structure unpredictably, offering interesting nuances on old themes, or presenting new variations on familiar tropes and devices. Or perhaps a writer disagrees with the common idea of moral goodness and wants to redefine some aspect of a genre. This is how a genre evolves, and writers of genre fiction are constantly trying to strike a balance between fulfilling their readers' expectations and trying to add something new. And this is not a hard and fast rule. Some writers and readers prefer things incredibly formulaic, others prefer things more uncertain. But this does show us how genre is not crippled by predictability, but supported by it. And nowhere is this more true than in fantasy, where we have to ground the fantastical unreality of our content in a way readers can recognize. Okay, so if genre is a recognizable story type, then what kind of recognizable story type is epic fantasy, and does Le Morte Darthur fit the description? If I'm going to argue that we can read Malory's Le Morte Darthur as epic fantasy, I must have a usable definition for epic fantasy, right? What are its tropes, its narrative devices, its recurring themes? These are ideas that have not only been discussed elsewhere, but have been beaten over the head with a lead hammer. And no matter how we try to define fantasy, some exception defies the definition. So while I will talk later about the features of epic fantasy, here I want to approach genre differently, following the guidance of Attebery, who proposes that genres be defined not by borders, but by centers, using a concept called fuzzy sets. Attebery's fuzzy sets proposes that genres be defined not by a clear boundary or any defining characteristic, but by a resemblance to a single core example or group of examples. Instead of trying to define epic fantasy, we identify several examples of the sort of book we think epitomize epic fantasy, and then we consider how well our book fits into that group. This allows for a more nuanced approach that acknowledges degrees of resemblance. The Lord of the Rings is definitely fantasy. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a little fantasy, and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is not fantasy at all, unless you think Mr. Darcy is too good to be true. Of fuzzy set's advantages, I'm going to narrow in at this one. It offers us a useful method for comparing text across historical periods, and in seeing a genre like fantasy in different historical contexts, we better understand the cultural work fantasy performs. Consider this quote from Attebery. Fuzzy set theory does not say much about history, audience, or purpose, but it does not conflict with those perspectives either, so long as we remember to ask not only to what extent is this story a fantasy, but also, how does this story relate to prior and subsequent instances of the fantastic? Who is the story addressed to? And what cultural work does the story undertake by being part of the fantasy category? Fuzzy sets do not require that we bind our text to their historical moment, so long as we remain conscious of that historical moment so we can reasonably interpret what the fantasy of the text is doing. This prevents us from misinterpreting signs that looked similar in Malory's time but function differently than they do in our own. Kind of like how knowledge of another language helps you see false friends, words that seem familiar but mean something entirely different. So it's not about erasing the original context or genre, but about suspending it, filtering it, or moving it into the background. Okay, so we've talked fuzzy sets. Let's use it to ask, what is epic fantasy, and what are core examples we can use to triangulate the genre? Core and obvious examples would include The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive or Mistborn trilogy, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy, Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, or N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. Other examples I would include are Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books, Frank Herbert's Dune, R.F. Kuang's Poppy War trilogy, or Daniel Heath Justice's The Way of Thorn and Thunder. Obviously, we cannot talk about all of these books in detail, but if you're familiar with even a few of them, it should give you a good idea of what I mean by epic fantasy. And if you're familiar with none of them, that's okay. I'm going to give a quick rundown of what I think unifies these texts and why Morte Darthur fits among them. Begin with the obvious. Much epic fantasy, of course, makes healthy use of the fantastic, the unreal, things that defy the laws of nature, such as sorcery or magical beasts. But it is important to remember that the fantastic by its very nature is limitless and can manifest in unlimited ways. Further, if an epic fantasy doesn't take place in a secondary world, that is, an invented world, that would be a major exception or subversion. Epic fantasies also have, as Tarul Parma Patel argues, the sense of a profound scale, and she isn't talking about page count. This is what makes the epic epic. Things do not just happen locally. The entire kingdom or world or universe gets involved in the story. And epics tend to treat their subject matter with epic sincerity or gravitas as well, often addressing big questions. Another thing Palmer Patel points to is that epic fantasy usually connects the fate of the protagonist to the fate of the world. As they succeed, the world succeeds. Should they fail, the world would fail. Lastly, as Attebery puts it, the characteristic structure of fantasy is comic. It begins with a problem and ends with resolution. Death, despair, horror, and betrayal may enter into a fantasy, but they must not be the final word. Much fantasy does not have what we would call a happy ending. Indeed, the fantasist often seems to start with the idea of such a resolution and then to qualify it, finding every hidden cost in the victory. Epic fantasy then tends toward victory. Sometimes this may be a happy ending, other times it is bittersweet at best, and sometimes it may be something even more complicated. But rarely do we see the Dark Lord triumph, our heroes defeated, evil reigning unchallenged over the world. And if we do see that, it is a deliberate break from the norm of the genre. Okay, so let's summarize. Epic fantasy contains a strong sense of fantasy elements like magic, but this could be anything so long as it is unreal. It takes place in another world. It has an epic sense of scale. It links the fate of the world to the heroes, and it tends toward the comic. This is not a definitive list, but I think it's pretty good for our purposes. Neither are these traits hard borders. To be epic fantasy, a text need not be all these things, and a text can only have a little of these qualities and still have some membership in epic fantasy. That's the nature of fuzzy sets. And if we think back to that list of novels again, you can decide for yourself how present these qualities are in that list. If there is a significant divergence from our description of the genre in our examples, then it is our description that would need changing. The examples are the foundation we are working from. Okay, we're almost there, but before we go any further, I think we're due for an extended TLDR on Sir Thomas Malory's Morte Darthur, so warning, spoilers ahead. Malory's book synthesizes a huge body of Arthurian legend into one text. It loosely follows Arthur's birth and conception, his rise to power, his life and kingship, and his death. It includes Arthur's pulling the sword from the stone, receiving Excalibur from a lady in a lake, and his humble conquest of Rome. While Arthur is our central figure, we actually follow other knights more often than not, including Sir Balin, Sir Gawain, Sir Lancelot, Sir Tristram, and more. And the glossary of names is long enough to make even a Malazan fan blink. Some of these quests include literal war, others are about love, but always, without fail, there will be jousting. The affairs between Tristram and Isolde and Lancelot and Guinevere play a prominent role, as does the feud between Gawain's family and seemingly everybody, but especially the French knights of Lancelot's family. A new generation is raised, showing the passage of time and the supposed stability of the Round Table. There is a Grail quest, and a few knights get to see the Grail, but many others die trying, while more still return home broken and defeated by their failures. In the end, Arthur's kingdom falls apart in a civil war after a series of escalations began by the unveiling of Lancelot and Guinevere's illicit relationship. Arthur dies at the hands of his son and would-be usurper Mordred, but slays Mordred in return. With his final breaths, Arthur has his famed sword Excalibur returned to the water, he is taken away to the Isle of Avalon, and it is prophesied that the once and future king would someday return to usher in another golden age. So, finally, at last, the question remains, can we read Le Morte Darthur as epic fantasy? Well, let's take our summary and think through the characteristics of the genre. Does it contain fantastical elements? There are magic swords and rings, spellcasters, giants and dragons, and something called a questing beast? But does it take place in a secondary world? I'm going to say yes, and here's why. Arthur's world may be based on our own, but the world of Arthurian romance is so removed from its origin point, so fictionalized by various writers, that it was and is, in essence, a fantasy world with magical elements and a distinct history. But does Le Morte Darthur have a profound sense of scale? Absolutely. By the height of his power, Arthur is king of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, France, and Emperor of Rome, and her characters are superlatively strong and idealistic. Is the fate of her characters connected to the fate of the world? With Arthur's ascension, the kingdom prospers, and with his demise, the kingdom collapses. Even on the smaller scale of individual stories, wherever our characters go, the local people prosper or suffer based on their actions. Finally, is it comic? See, this one is the most interesting, because on some important level, it is tragic. Arthur's peace could not last and was debatably far less stable than suggested. That being said, there is a sense that something great was achieved. Lancelot is all but sainted, and Arthur is given a grand tomb to memorialize his achievements. And on some level, we have to acknowledge his success, because we're still telling stories about him. The implications of the prophecy are clear. Arthur will return, one way or another. Even if you disagree that Le Morte's ending qualifies in some sense as comic, I think it's clear that we can definitely read Le Morte Darthur as fantasy. And even if we suspected that from the start, I think laying out the grounds for that idea is important. So how does this change our reading? What exactly is different about reading Le Morte as fantasy? There are a few things we can point to, but two stand out in particular. The first is that when read as an epic fantasy, Le Morte is unified as one text. Chivalric romance is used a technique called enlacement. Enlacement carries story elements from one independent narrative into another, chaining them together to create a larger text that is not necessarily unified from beginning to end, but is tenuously connected by the links in the chain. It has been argued even that the sections on Sir Tristram, which comprise nearly a third of Le Morte Darthur, are really extra and unneeded for the overall plot and could be removed. Reading Le Morte Darthur as an epic fantasy forces us to grapple with it as one text, taking this middle section and considering how it world builds or sets up the final section, a function of the books of Sir Tristram that may be overlooked when read as a chivalric romance. The second thing is how the text subverts the typical story structure of epic fantasy. On a smaller scale, individual stories follow what you'd expect. A hero sets out on a goal, overcomes challenges, and is celebrated by the community. But on a macro scale, the text is quite odd. To put it simply, Arthur's climax is too early. Normally, a character peaks toward the end of the story, just before or after the narrative climax. But Arthur is crowned Emperor of Rome and successfully incorporates a new generation of knights into the Round Table in the first third of the book. He has nowhere to go but down. The Grail quest comes closer to the end, but is honestly as tragic as it is comic, marking the final great quest of Camelot. Some tales seem to offer enigmatic messages closer to the tone of a fairy story, while others offer direct political commentary. We can see how our understanding of narrative changes even as the plot stays the same, and when we dig deeper, I'm sure more details will emerge. But that's the topic for another video. The goal of this video was to establish whether we could read Le Morte Darthur as epic fantasy and how that could possibly be done, and the answer is definitely yes. And in working through that problem in detail, I think we have come to understand genre and epic fantasy a little better. At least, I know I have. So thank you for watching or listening. I hope to have been educational or entertaining or some combination of both. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video and leave a comment if you want to join the conversation. Happy reading.